They inserted 297 years into history, and almost no one noticed dot in the heavy silence that hangs between the fall of Rome and the rise of the High Middle Ages. We are told of a time called the Dark Ages, a time of regression, a time of stillness, a time when the flame of classical knowledge flickered low. But what if that silence is not natural? What if it was engineered? A manufactured void between antiquity and modernity, created not by decay, but by design? Let us begin where things vanish. Between AD 614 and AD 911, Europe stands in an eerie hush. The Roman Empire is gone, but nothing rises to take its place in any consistent, credible way. The architecture is minimal, the population scarcely grows, literacy plummets, but curiously, there are magnificent structures dated to this period. There are coinage and chronicles. And yet, the question that haunts us is not what remains, but what doesn't. How does one explain the phantom time hypothesis? Proposed by German historian Herbert Illig in the 1990s and drawing on earlier musings by Wilhelm Kamier, it suggests a bold, almost blasphemous idea that 3 centuries of European history, specifically from 614 to 911, never happened. They were inserted, fabricated, an elaborate hoax by the Holy Roman Emperor Otto III, Pope Sylvester II, and possibly Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII, all with a shared motive: to reset the calendar and place themselves at the dawn of the new millennium, AD 1000. A symbolic rebirth of the Christian world with themselves as its new founding fathers. What could drive such a deceit? Power, prestige, prophecy. But to invent time itself to insert history, like a parchment forged in the shadows, requires more than ambition. It demands complicity across monasteries, scribes, imperial bureaucracies, and the ecclesiastical elite. It would need rewritten chronicles, redated coins, adjusted astronomical calculations. And yet, as implausible as it sounds, the cracks in our inherited timeline are hard to ignore. Take the Julian and Gregorian calendars. By the time Pope Gregory XIII corrected the calendar in 1582, there was a misalignment of 10 days. Yet mathematically, after nearly 1,600 years of drift, the discrepancy should have been 13 days. Why the 3-day gap? Could it be that those missing centuries were never there? Herbert Illig calculated that only 1,297 years had passed since the birth of Christ, not the accepted 1,614. If true, then we are living in the 18th century, not the 21st. Impossible, or simply unthinkable? Consider the glaring emptiness of these so-called dark centuries. Europe, once ablaze with Roman roads, libraries, and aqueducts, enters a period where literacy and record-keeping decline, but not uniformly. In isolated monastic outposts, texts appear with sudden bursts of sophistication, like the Carolingian minuscule, an elegant script that emerges fully formed under Charlemagne's supposed rule, a new script without a visible evolution, a linguistic jump with no traceable bridge. And what of Charlemagne himself, a colossal figure, king of the Franks, first Holy Roman Emperor, uniter of Europe? Yet many scholars now question his very historicity. Contemporary sources are sparse. His biography by Einhard reads more like hagiography than history. Could Charlemagne have been a mythic pastiche invention to fill the void that his co-conspirators had carved into time? The Aachen Chapel, Charlemagne's architectural gem, is another anomaly. Built in the 8th century, it displays features too advanced for its era, more in line with Byzantine or late Roman structures. Its dome, geometry, and mosaic seem to echo Constantinople, not a fragmented post-Roman West. Who had the skill to build it, and where did they go afterward? There's a danger in asking these questions. To pull at one thread is to risk unraveling the entire tapestry. But the inconsistencies accumulate. Documents from this period are rife with contradictions. Royal annals skip years without comment. Papal successions are murky, riddled with gaps. Artifacts are scarce, and those that do exist often carry date. Inscriptions that appear tampered with, eras overwritten. Digits scratched into stone as if the passage of time itself were being redacted. Why does Byzantine history, rich and detailed, show a different rhythm? Why do Chinese astronomers record celestial events that contradict European chronology? Why do Islamic scholars mention no equivalent period of silence? Could it be that Eastern traditions, guided by different calendars and religious imperatives, remained tethered to reality while the West drifted into a dream script written by popes and kings? Chronology is power. To define what year it is to define who reigns over time. The Julian calendar served Rome well, but to claim the year 1000 as the turning point, an apocalypse averted, a savior born anew, was to declare oneself the anchor of salvation history. Otto III wanted to rule not only the present, but the very flow of centuries, and so 614 to 911 became a canvas. Events were invented or misstated, wars exaggerated, kings duplicated, manuscripts retroactively produced, the bones of saints found at convenient moments, the legends of Charlemagne infused with echoes of Arthur and Constantine. A sacred fiction was crafted, layered with enough incense and ink to obscure its artificial seams. But the truth hides in the gaps. Why do archaeological digs across Western Europe reveal fewer structures, burials, and tools from this period than expected? Why are entire villages dated to the 7th or 10th centuries, with nothing in between? Why do inscriptions vanish and then reappear as if from exile? Can time truly be faked? Or is our history like a palimpsest, written, erased, and rewritten again by those who knew that to master time was to master memory? If 297 years were invented, what else might be? And if we accept that centuries can be conjured by quill and crown, how do we know what year it is now? Time was supposed to be universal, unyielding, rooted in the cosmos, and immune to corruption. And yet, when we trace the calendars of civilizations, we find not harmony, but fracture. Discordant dates, parallel eras, and epochs that refuse to align. It is here, in these cracks between chronologies, that suspicion blooms. If the history we have inherited is true, then why does time feel off? The Julian calendar, imposed by Julius Caesar in 45 BC, was designed to harmonize civil time with the solar year. It added a leap day every 4 years, creating a cycle of 365.25 days. But this calculation was imperfect. The solar year is roughly 11 minutes shorter. Over centuries, those minutes add up, pushing the calendar slowly out of alignment with the seasons. By the 16th century, the spring equinox, which should fall on March 21st, had drifted to March 11th. To correct this, Pope Gregory XIII introduced the Gregorian calendar in 1582. 10 days were simply erased. October 4th was followed by October 15th. A clean excision, like a surgeon removing a cancerous growth from the body of time. But here lies the enigma. The Julian calendar would have required a 13-day correction by that point. Not 10. Where did the missing 3 days go? According to Illig's hypothesis, they were absorbed by phantom centuries, years that never truly existed. Time had already been rewritten once. And the Gregorian reform, far from being a correction, was a continuation of the deception. A second layer of paint over a falsified canvas. Even more troubling is how other civilizations kept time. The Byzantine Empire followed its own calendar, measuring years from what it believed was the date of creation, 5509 BC. When the West declared the year 1000, the East called it 6509. But Byzantine records, rich with astronomical observations, imperial decrees, and ecclesiastical writings, suggest no awareness of a 3-century lull. There is no shadowed void between 614 and 911 in Constantinople's chronicles. China, too, maintained meticulous records of solar eclipses, comets, and planetary alignments. These events are datable, verifiable, and consistent. Yet some of the astronomical events described in Chinese annals fail to correspond with European accounts. The skies diverge, as if the heavens themselves resisted the Western narrative. Consider the Byzantine chronicler Theophanes the Confessor, whose chronographia spans from AD 284 to 813. He details imperial reigns, theological debates, and celestial phenomena. But many of the events he records between the 7th and 9th centuries are missing from Western sources. Entire emperors appear in the East with no Western acknowledgement. Battles are fought without Western reaction. The two halves of Christendom drift, not just theologically, but temporally. This East-West discrepancy becomes more profound when we examine papal chronologies. Between Pope Boniface V. R. 619 to 625, and Pope Formosus R. 891 to 896, the papal records grow foggy. Popes rise and vanish with minimal documentation. Tombs go unmarked. Edicts are scarce. And yet, we are told that Rome remained the heart of the Christian world. How does this center of Christendom leave behind so little? There is also the matter of regnal years, how rulers marked their reigns. In many European documents, kings are said to have ruled for implausibly long periods, or their successions overlap without clear transitions. Sometimes, rulers are retroactively inserted into lineages, their deeds backdated to earlier decades. It's as if their reigns were written to fill a temporal vacuum, like scaffolding erected to support a collapsing structure. The contradictions are not just in the texts, they are etched into stone. In Germany, the Magdeburg ivory's carved panels, depicting scenes from the life of Christ, are believed to have been made for Otto I around 968. But stylistically, they resemble late Roman work, closer to the 4th or 5th centuries. Scholars debate whether the ivories were reused, recarved, or misdated. None of the explanations fully satisfy. They stand as a temporal orphan, their true origins veiled. And consider the construction of the Palatine Chapel in Aachen. Officially built around 800 AD by Charlemagne, it mirrors the octagonal design of San Vitale in Ravenna, constructed in the 6th century. The resemblance is uncanny. Not inspiration, but replication. Yet no architectural lineage connects the two. The intervening centuries contain no examples that bridge this design evolution, as if 500 years of architectural history were simply absent. Is it possible that we are not looking at a progression of styles, but a loop? Could the revival of classical forms in the Carolingian era be not a renaissance, but a relic, a surviving technique wrongly dated? If artisans copied from living memory, not ancient ruins, then the time between Rome and Aachen is not revivalist, but contemporaneous. The Renaissance, too, may have been a rediscovery not of antiquity, but of a world that never truly vanished, only overwritten. If 3 centuries were inserted, they would need to be synchronized with existing events, wars, coronations, comets. But synchronization is difficult. It leaves seams. And those seams are what we now see in the discordant calendars of East and West, in the divergence of regnal lists, in the dissonance between papal and imperial chronologies. We are told these inconsistencies are normal, that ancient historians were prone to error, that medieval scribes copied poorly, misunderstood time, or fabricated lineages to suit their patrons. But what if these inconsistencies are not accidents? What if they are the scar tissue of a deeper wound, a manipulation so vast that it required the recalibration of time itself? If Charlemagne was a fiction, if the year 1000 was a symbolic illusion, then every event before and after bends under its weight. What if the East remembered what the West chose to forget? And if our calendars were forged, what else has been scripted beneath the ticking of the clock? There is a moment in the late 10th century where three powerful figures converge not on a battlefield, not in a council, but in a story half buried beneath the veils of time. Otto III, the Holy Roman Emperor, Pope Sylvester II, the intellectual pontiff, and Constantine VII, the learned emperor of Byzantium. Together, they form an axis, a trinity, not of theology, but of historical manipulation. Did they collaborate? Not to shape the future, but to rewrite the past? The triple forgery hypothesis posits that these men entrenched in power, steeped in ambition, worked to fabricate a chapter of history, fusing fiction and propaganda into the bones of Europe's timeline. Each had motive, each had means, but above all, each had a vision: to align themselves with the sacred year, to wrap their reigns in prophetic inevitability. Consider Otto III. He ascended to the imperial throne in 996, young and idealistic, yet obsessed with Rome. Not the decaying city of his own day, but a glorious imagined past, an empire of saints and emperors, of Augustus and Constantine. Otto saw himself not just as ruler, but as restorer. He wanted to return Europe to a Christian golden age, but for that, he needed a new year zero. A moment of divine symmetry. Enter Pope Sylvester II, formerly Gerbert of Aurillac, a mathematician and astronomer educated in Islamic Spain. He introduced the abacus and Arabic numerals to the West. He studied celestial cycles. He understood calendars and how to bend them. It was under Sylvester's papacy that the idea of the millennium gained traction. A D1000 is both an end and a beginning, a sacred hinge in time, but it is Constantine VII who completes the triad. A scholar emperor in the Byzantine court, he commissioned historical works to glorify his dynasty, including De Administrando Imperio and De Ceremonias. He compiled genealogies, fabricated lineages, and revised the imperial past to elevate his own legitimacy. His court knew how to script history, not just to remember it, but to control it. What if these three rulers, each with their scribes, their monks, their secretariats, conspired to align their empires around a forged chronology? Let us not forget, timekeeping in the early Middle Ages was not universal. There was no centralized calendar authority. Monasteries kept local annals. Kings measured years by reigns, not dates. Dates shifted, eras overlapped. In this chaos, a skilled hand could rearrange the sequence of history, adding decades here, a century there. The illusion would hold, especially if it served God and empire. One piece of this puzzle lies in the donation of Constantine, a document purportedly from the 4th century, in which Emperor Constantine the first supposedly gave authority over the Western Roman Empire to the Pope. It was later exposed as a forgery crafted in the 8th century, but for centuries, it legitimized papal power. If such a bold textual invention could alter church authority, what stopped them from forging not just a document, but an entire epic? Let us look closer at Charlemagne, crowned emperor in 800 by Pope Leo III. His reign marks the symbolic rebirth of the Roman Empire in the West, but curiously, his image is murky. His biographies contradict each other. No contemporary likeness survives. His imperial coronation lacks strong contemporaneous evidence and is remembered more as legend than lived fact. Could Charlemagne be a composite, a mythical emperor created by Otto and Sylvester to establish precedent for Otto's own reign? Supporting this theory is the awkward temporal proximity between Otto III and Charlemagne. Otto visits Charlemagne's tomb in Aachen in the year 1000, exhuming the body, declaring it incorrupt. But why this act of theatrical devotion, 2 centuries after Charlemagne's supposed death? Because, some argue, Otto had only just created Charlemagne. The exhumation was not reverence, it was performance. A public relic-making to substantiate a recently fabricated legend. Further cracks appear in the royal genealogies. The Carolingian dynasty supposedly stretched from the 8th to the 10th century. But later medieval chroniclers often confuse Carolingian kings, mixing their deeds and dates. Some kings appear twice under different names. Others vanish entirely. Their reigns seem to exist more in parchment than in stone or soil. And what of the imperial regalia? Crown jewels, scepters, and orbs allegedly dating from Charlemagne's time are difficult to trace. Many were discovered or rediscovered during Otto's reign, conveniently bolstering the illusion of continuity. If relics of the early empire were needed to prove its past, why do so many appear precisely when Otto needs them most? We are told to trust the sources' chronicles like the Anno Regni, Francorum, or Einhard's Vita Caroli Magni, but these texts are themselves suspect. They rely on earlier, untraceable sources. Some exist only in later copies. Scribes routinely adjusted dates to fit theological schemes. Passages were interpolated. Saints were inserted. Miracles added posthumously. These weren't mistakes. They were messages crafted to influence, to legitimate, to inspire. They built a sacred narrative, not an objective record. And when such narratives are canonized by the church and state alike, to question them becomes heresy, even the very use of Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord, was a tool of synchronization. Popularized by the Venerable Bede in the 8th century, it didn't fully take hold in Europe until the 10th and 11th centuries, conveniently around the time the forgery solidified. Could this dating system itself have been introduced to fix a forged timeline into a single manipulable continuum? We are staring into a hall of mirrors, each reflecting a history that may never have occurred. 3 men, 1 aim. To fabricate the past in order to rule the present. What if the most sacred numbers in Western history, 800, 911, 1000, are not divine appointments, but imperial inventions? And if history itself can be forged, who today holds the pen? History's grandest deception often hides not in absence, but in presence without explanation. A temple stands, a chapel shines, a cathedral endures, and yet no hands are remembered. No tools remain, no surrounding culture survives to account for their creation. These orphaned monuments, too advanced for their context, speak not only of forgotten knowledge, but perhaps of knowledge that was never meant to be remembered. The Palatine Chapel in Aachen, consecrated in the year 805, is one such structure. Its octagonal symmetry, domed vault, and polychrome mosaics bear the unmistakable fingerprint of late Roman or Byzantine design. Yet we are told it was built during the reign of Charlemagne in the so-called Carolingian Renaissance, an era that, paradoxically, left behind little else of comparable mastery. This architectural marvel appears as a singularity in time, a lone flame in a supposed darkness. Who built this? We search for workshops, for drafts, for drawings, for training lineages, and find none. There is no surviving tradition linking this structure to anything that came before or after in Western Europe. No intermediate stage of development, no student works. The Palatine Chapel rises like a dream with no waking point. An echo without a source. It is often compared to San Vitale in Ravenna, constructed nearly 3 centuries earlier. Their similarities are uncanny: the octagonal plan, the use of spolia, the interplay of light and domed space. Yet if Aachen is a product of the 9th century, it exists in a vacuum. Architecture, like language, typically evolves. Yet here we see a leap, unmediated and unprepared. A Roman-Byzantine blueprint resurrected without scaffolding. Is this a revival or a residue? We are told the Carolingian Renaissance ushered in a rebirth of classical learning and art. But aside from Aachen, the monuments are sparse, the manuscripts derivative, the artistic output more schematic than inspired. We find patterns, not flourishes. Echoes, not inventions. In Lorsch Abbey, the famed Torhael Gatehouse, is often cited as another gem of Carolingian architecture. Built circa 800, it blends Roman triumphal motifs with Frankish elements. But again, what are its precedents? Who designed it? The brickwork mimics imperial Roman proportions with stunning precision, yet no Roman-trained masons were supposedly alive to instruct them. And after this period, such forms vanish again until the Romanesque wave centuries later. Architecture, like biology, leaves fossils. But here, we find footprints without a walker, bones without lineage. This pattern is not unique to Aachen. Across Europe, there are buildings dated to the 8th or 9th century that seem anachronistically advanced stone churches in England with precise ashlar masonry, vaulted crypts in France with load-bearing ingenuity, frescoes that recall lost classical palettes. These are not rural improvisations. They are works of trained minds. But where are the schools, the texts, the failed experiments? It is as if these works were not the beginning of something, but the leftover of something else. Could it be that these buildings are misdated? That they are relics of a Roman world far closer in time than we believe? Or more provocatively are they deliberate plants in a falsified timeline, meant to lend physical credence to centuries that never were? We are told that coins, chronicles, and charters support the dating. But each is vulnerable. Coins are often reissued, copied, or minted in styles long out of use. Chronicles are written decades, if not centuries, after the events they describe. And charters, the legal instruments of the early medieval world, are notoriously interpolated. Even the famed Capitulary of Charlemagne has been shown to contain later editions. We walk through ruins with no builders, even the artisans. Marks the mason's symbols etched into stone fail to provide clarity. They appear inconsistently. Some are identical to those in Roman structures. Others reappear, unchanged, in Romanesque sites 2 centuries later. There is no clear progression, no technical evolution. Just repetition, as if templates were copied without context. In the Cathedral of Germigny-des-Prés, built around 806, we find a mosaic of startling detail, depicting the Ark of the Covenant. But this art form was believed lost in Western Europe. For centuries, who commissioned it? Who executed it? And why does its iconography suggest theological concerns absent from contemporary debates? Let us return to Aachen one final time. The Palatine Chapel was designed by Otto of Metz, at least. That is the name preserved. But Otto left behind no writings. No other buildings are attributed to him. No school followed his method. His name is more a placeholder than a person, an anonymous mask to satisfy historical inquiry. Does this not resemble myth-making? The Romans built monuments over generations with chains of architects, engineers, apprentices. Byzantium refined this knowledge over centuries. Yet somehow, in the post-Roman West, these structures emerge full-grown, like Athena from the head of Zeus divine perfect. Contextless. The conventional explanation is that knowledge survived in monasteries, passed down in sacred texts. But building is not theory, it is practice. A blueprint is useless without hands trained in the work, without techniques refined across projects, without communal memory embedded in stone and sweat. If the Carolingian era truly revived Roman art, where are the failures? Where are the half-finished attempts, the collapsed arches, the novice errors? Revival leaves fingerprints. Here, we find only finished works and missing fingers. This is not evolution. It is insertion. If these temples are real, but their creators are not, then who placed them? And if they were built in a different time, what does that say about the era claimed to have birthed them? History is measured not only by wars and empires, but by the quiet ticking of time, by the dated edict, the celestial alignment, the feast day, the royal birth, the coronation. And yet, within the core of the medieval timeline, there lies a strange quiet, a soft void, a stretch of years that seem neither lived nor remembered. They are inked into our calendars, taught in our schools, and yet they are felt nowhere in the rhythm of continuity. What if a year, no, hundreds of years never happened at all? The problem is not merely that these years are empty. It is that they are uniformly empty. From Scandinavia to the Pyrenees, from the Papal States to the Slavic frontiers, the records between roughly 614 and 911 blur. Not vanish blur. They exist just enough to avoid suspicion, just enough to lend weight to the illusion. But dig into any one of them, and you find echoes instead of events, rituals without context, names without biographies. Take, for example, the Edict of Paris, 614. Attributed to King Clothar II, it is considered one of the first legal attempts to limit the power of the nobility and restructure Frankish administration. And yet, after this document, a sophisticated, structured legal code, the trail of reform disappears. There is no follow-up, no gradual implementation, just stillness. How does such a foundational law leave no ripples? Then comes the Carolingian moment. In theory, the reign of Charlemagne and his successors provides a rich period of imperial expansion, Christianization, and cultural rebirth. But look closer. The timeline between the Edict of Paris and Charlemagne's coronation in 800 feels constructed, not lived. The rulers between Clothar and Charles, Martel, emerge and fade with minimal evidence, often known only by regnal years and lists, not by the deeds or texts that usually define an age. A timeline should feel thick with the friction of human lives. Instead, this one glides too easily. One of the most curious examples lies in the Council of Frankfurt in 794. Here, Charlemagne presided over debates on iconoclasm, adoptionism, and the regulation of the church. But where are the papal letters referencing this? Why do Eastern records, rich with theological polemic, mention no echo of such a gathering? And why does the next major council in the West not occur until over a century later? More disquieting still is the sudden appearance of documents claiming to be centuries old, just in time to fill this suspicious gap. The Chronicon Universale, for instance, is a 9th century compilation that attempts to synchronize Christian history with classical chronology. But it is riddled with contradictions, overlapping reigns, reused imperial names, misaligned events. It reads more like a script than a record. Astronomy offers yet another chasm. The monk Bede, writing in the 8th century, based his Easter tables on cycles of the moon and sun. His calculations were admired for their accuracy. But when modern astronomers compare recorded celestial events, eclipses, comets, planetary conjunctions to the dates offered in medieval annals, mismatches arise. An eclipse recorded in 733 cannot be reconciled with orbital data. A conjunction listed in 879 appears to have occurred in 600, as if the events happened, but not when we say they did. Time, it seems, was misfiled. This distortion becomes stark in the calendar reforms. As discussed, the Gregorian correction of 1582 removed only 10 days from the calendar. But the Julian calendar had drifted about 1 day every 128 years. By 1582, it should have been 13 days out of sync, not 10. A shortfall of 3 days, approximately 300 years of unaccounted time. The exact duration of the phantom centuries. Coincidence or calibration? Now consider the archaeological layer. In most medieval towns, the stratigraphy, those sedimentary layers of human activity, reveals occupation, destruction, rebuilding. But the levels between late antiquity and the Romanesque revival are suspiciously thin. In some cases, they are disturbed, missing, or compressed. Radiocarbon dating from structures allegedly built in the 8th or 9th centuries sometimes yield dates 2 to 3 centuries older. This is explained away as reuse of materials. But what if it isn't? What if the stones remember a chronology that the scribes erased? Architecture again plays accomplice to suspicion. The Basilica of Saint Denis, north of Paris, is considered the cradle of Gothic architecture. Rebuilt by Abbot Suger in the 12th century, it supposedly replaced a Carolingian church, which itself succeeded a Merovingian chapel. But where is the Carolingian structure? The transitional forms? Only fragments remain uncertain, unsourced, unanchored. It's as if the original was not replaced, but invented through absence. Even liturgy bears the scar. Several feast days, especially those attributed to saints who lived during the 7th to 9th centuries, appear suddenly in manuscripts written much later. Their cults emerge fully formed, with biographies, miracles, and relics, yet no trace in prior records. The saints appear to be inserted retrospectively, fulfilling political or devotional needs centuries after their supposed lives. One glaring example is Saint Philibert, whose life straddles the late 7th century. His relics were moved several times, each transfer accompanied by miraculous tales. But the first reliable mention of Philibert appears in documents from the 10th century. His hagiography includes anachronistic references to institutions that did not yet exist during his life. Such saints act as placeholders, anchors in a fabricated sea dot, and then there is the odd silence of disaster. If 3 centuries passed between Rome and the medieval revival, where are the earthquakes, the plagues, the famines that history never fails to preserve? These events linger not only in chronicles but in burials, in soil, in tax records. But here they whisper and fade. The few that are mentioned, like the famine of 792, are uncorroborated by archaeology or foreign sources. No tree ring data supports a wide-scale climate anomaly at that time. The suffering is written but not buried. Why does this span of history produce so many anomalies and so few artifacts? Why do we have so many dated documents but so little verifiable life behind them? Could it be that these years were never truly lived, but were instead constructed? And if there is a year that never happened, how many more are hiding behind it? Coins are often considered the most objective witnesses of history. Cold, metallic, dated. Meant for commerce, not for myth. They do not flatter kings, nor embellish events. They bear names, faces, and years, pressed into copper, silver, and gold, circulated across borders, lost in soil, and found centuries later. And yet, even these trusted relics of the past carry strange silences. What happens when coins speak of a world that left no other trace? The monetary systems of early medieval Europe, particularly between the 7th and 9th centuries, offer a peculiar glimpse into the heart of the phantom time. Coins attributed to this period exist, yes, but their context evaporates upon examination. They appear without supporting evidence of trade routes, market centers, or significant economic infrastructure. The coin survives, but the economy it presupposes does not. Consider the coinage of Charlemagne. He introduced the denarius, a silver penny designed to unify the realm's currency. Historians hail it as a financial reform, a stabilizing gesture, in a fragmented post-Roman world. But the coins themselves raise more questions than they answer. For one, they appear abruptly, with no evolutionary predecessors. Their weight and purity suggest access to refined minting techniques and steady silver sources, yet no mines, no trade routes, no smelting records substantiate this. And while thousands of denarii have been unearthed across Europe, they are rarely found in hoards consistent with known settlements or centers of power. Instead, they are scattered, isolated coins with no towns, no roads, no bodies. The people who used them have vanished, leaving behind only the echo of transactions. In England, the coinage of Offa, of Mercia contemporary to Charlemagne, includes a famous gold piece inscribed with Arabic script, "There's no God but Allah." The coin appears to mimic an Abbasid dinar, yet it was likely never intended for circulation. It is a curious blend of reverence, mimicry, and misunderstanding. But what if its strangeness reflects more than diplomatic experiment? What if it reveals a distortion, an artifact trying to patch together irreconcilable timelines? Another anomaly. Merovingian tremises, small gold coins struck between the 6th and 8th centuries, vary wildly in design and quality. Many are so crudely struck that identifying the ruler or mint is nearly impossible. Others mimic Roman coinage with uncanny fidelity, suggesting either a much closer connection to late antiquity than believed, or a deliberate attempt to bridge a chronological chasm. Numismatists often point out a pattern. After the fall of the Roman Empire, coin production diminishes sharply. This is expected. But then, instead of gradually returning in a visible arc of innovation and increasing complexity, coins from the late 8th and 9th centuries suddenly mirror forms of the 4th and 5th. Styles reappear without intermediary steps. Images of emperors diademed, robed re-emerge on Western coinage as though the intervening centuries had never happened. Is this revival or recycling? There is also the unsettling matter of overstruck coins. In several cases, Carolingian denarii have been found struck over earlier Roman and Merovingian pieces. This was not unusual. Precious metals were scarce. But the reuse of Roman flans centuries after Rome's fall raises eyebrows. Why were these blanks still available? Why do some overstrikes bear legends and faces from radically different epochs? And how do we explain the forgeries? Not forgeries made in modern times, but coins minted in the early medieval period that imitate Roman emperors who lived centuries earlier. Numismatists often label these as barbarous imitations, assuming ignorance or nostalgia. But the forgeries are sometimes too precise, replicating emperors who were barely remembered even in Byzantine texts. Could it be that the imitations were not due to ignorance, but to the need to simulate a continuous imperial tradition? To invent time by repurposing the past? Even more disturbingly, there are entire reigns known almost only by coins. Kings, like Sigeric of Essex or obscure Carolingian pretenders, appear in numismatic records, yet leave no written traces, no laws, no battles, no burials. They are known because a few coins bear their names. Is this sufficient? Or have the coins themselves been planted in the soil of our imagination to flesh out a hollowed century? Byzantine coinage adds to the dissonance. The empire minted solidly in falls with rigorous consistency. Their metallurgical profiles are well documented, their mint marks clear. And yet, some of the emperors said to rule during the phantom centuries minted fewer coins than less powerful rulers before or after. This would imply massive inflation, breakdown in commerce, or perhaps rulers invented post facto to stitch an unbroken chain. Islamic coins, by contrast, tell a different story. The Umayyad and Abbasid dynasties produced vast quantities of dinars and dirhams, inscribed with Quranic verses and mint dates, tied to the Hijri calendar. These coins align reliably with recorded historical events and celestial phenomena. But their synchronization with Western chronology becomes murky. Events described in Muslim sources fail to match the timeline assigned by Christian Europe. Wars do not correspond. Conquests are misaligned. Again, the fabric tears. Why do coins that should speak a universal language begin to contradict one another? And why do so many early medieval mints appear in locations where archaeology reveals no substantial settlements, no workshops, no markets, no population centers to justify the need for currency? Coins are not made in isolation. They reflect an entire apparatus: mining, minting, metallurgy, transport, commerce. To produce them, a society must be organized, literate, and economically alive. Yet when we reach into the supposed economic body of the 7th to 9th centuries, we grasp only mist. The coins are real, but are the worlds they describe imaginary? And if our most objective artifacts carry the fingerprints of forgery, what else has been minted into memory, pressed into the metal of myth? Beneath the glass of museums and the dust of monastic vaults lie the manuscripts of the Middle Ages, illuminated, glossed, and revered. We call them the vessels of preserved wisdom, the lifeline between antiquity and the modern world. And yet, a careful eye sees something troubling. Too much continuity in script where history suggests there should be none. Letters evolve in silence. Languages leap centuries in the span of a page. And always, behind the ink, the shadow of fabrication grows longer. What happens when handwriting outpaces history? Consider the script known as Carolingian minuscula. Clear, legible handwriting system that became the standard across Europe during the Carolingian Renaissance. It emerges fully formed around the late 8th century, attributed to Alcuin of York, a scholar in Charlemagne's court. But this attribution rests on shaky foundations. There are no draft versions, no transitional alphabets, no mistakes. It arrives as a miracle of clarity in a sea of prior Gothic irregularity. How does an entirely new writing system, standardized across distant monastic communities, arise almost overnight, without regional deviations, without scribal resistance? Scholars argue that this was a reform of script, intended to promote literacy and theological unity. But reform requires process. And process leaves traces, evolving forms, scribal manuals, contested variants. Yet Carolingian minuscule appears simultaneously in France, Germany, and northern Italy as though dictated, not developed. Is this not a sign of orchestration? Manuscripts dated to the 9th century show not only the use of this minuscule script, but sophisticated page layouts, precise marginalia, consistent abbreviations. And yet the tools, the teaching models, the training centers that would have produced such uniformity are absent. If every monk became a calligrapher, where is the record of their instruction? The Codex Aureus of Lorsch, for instance, is an exquisite gospel book produced in this script. Lavish gold ink, full-page miniatures, and precise writing suggest a monastic infrastructure of incredible wealth and training. Yet no town, no scriptorium, no workshop at Lorsch survives to account for it. The Codex seems to appear from nowhere and lead to nothing. This is not a solitary case. The Utrecht Psalter, another 9th century treasure, is rendered in an energetic, semi-cursive version of Carolingian minuscule. Its illustrations are vibrant, classical in theme, and curiously unmedieval. The figures wear Roman garb, inhabit Roman architecture, and express emotions with a psychological subtlety unseen until the Renaissance. Scholars argue that it was inspired by earlier Roman models, but where are those models? None survive. Were they fabricated alongside the Psalter to give it roots? Even the texts copied during this period raise questions. Boethius, Augustine, Isidore of Seville all copied and recopied during the Carolingian Renaissance. But many of these copies are the earliest known versions. There are no earlier manuscripts to compare. No versions from the 5th to 7th centuries, only these pristine 9th century editions, often penned in uniform script with no evidence of scribal drift. Are they copies? Or are they the originals, retroactively dated to imply a longer chain of transmission? In some cases, the content itself betrays the illusion. The Annal Lauricenses, or Royal Frankish Annals, span the reigns of the early Carolingians. Yet their entries show suspiciously anachronistic concerns. Their tone aligns too neatly with Otto III's imperial vision. Their language is sterile, their style mechanical. Whole decades pass with only cursory events recorded, battles won, emissaries received, feasts celebrated. The texture of daily life, the ferment of politics, the richness of culture all are missing. It reads less like history and more like a scaffold built to support historical architecture. And then there is the troubling problem of duplication. Several monastic chronicles from different regions appear to copy each other word for word, even for local events supposedly experienced independently. One might expect stylistic similarity, shared sources, but perfect overlap in phrasing suggests a central template, not local witnessing. If a monastery in Ricano writes the same events as one in Tours, down to identical adjectives, are they chronicling or reciting? Forgery was not rare in the Middle Ages. Documents were forged to claim land, relics, or authority. Charters were altered, genealogies expanded. Saints were invented to legitimize shrines. But manuscript forgery required more than a quill. It required historical imagination and temporal control. The forger of a manuscript did not merely write. He inserted his work into time, embedding it among the layers of memory. He gave his text false roots so that future scholars would find it and believe the past had spoken. And behind many of these texts stands the same institutional silhouette, the church, the monastic scriptoria that preserved ancient wisdom also controlled the flow of time. They decided what was copied, what was destroyed, and what was invented. Their authority was absolute, their records unquestioned. If the Church had motive to construct a continuous Christian chronology to legitimize the papal line, the Holy Roman Empire, or the dating of Easter, would it not have used the pen to do so? The Catholic Church canonized not only saints, but centuries. And what of the palimpsests? In several early medieval manuscripts, older texts have been scraped off to reuse the parchment. In some cases, these underlying texts are classical. But, more intriguingly, some erased writings appear to be near contemporaneous, suggesting a deliberate attempt to overwrite the immediate past. Why erase a gospel from the 8th century, only to replace it with one from the 9th? Why not preserve both? What was being hidden beneath the ink? Handwriting analysis, the study of scripts over time, shows chronological inconsistencies. Scripts from supposedly earlier periods sometimes appear more evolved than later ones. Ligatures disappear and reappear. Letter forms thought extinct resurface centuries later. Either scribes were reviving forgotten forms without explanation, or time itself was rearranged to suit a new narrative. Is our faith in the written word misplaced? We trust manuscripts as fossils of thought, anchors in the past. But if those manuscripts were scripted in the service of empire, of church, of calendar, then they are not fossils, but fossils carved by hand. Artifacts of fiction. If script was used not to preserve time, but to fabricate it, then the page is not a window, but a veil. And what truths still lie erased beneath the parchment, waiting to be read in the shadows? There is no ceremony more powerful than coronation. A mortal, raised above all others by divine right, anointed with oil, crowned by sacred hands. This ritual is not mere spectacle, it is the binding of time, power, and eternity. But what if one of the most iconic coronations in Western history, the moment an empire was reborn, never happened at all? On Christmas Day in the year 800, we are told, Pope Leo III placed a crown on the head of Charlemagne in St. Peter's Basilica, proclaiming him Emperor of the Romans. It is a foundational event in the narrative of medieval Europe. The Holy Roman Empire was born, Rome reclaimed, the West resurrected. But the momentousness of the event is betrayed by a deafening silence. There are no eyewitnesses. No first-hand account survives from anyone present. No pope's diary, no bishop's letter, no nobleman's chronicle. Charlemagne himself, in letters and edicts, says nothing of the coronation. No gratitude, no pride, no acknowledgement. In fact, Einhard, his biographer and close courtier, claims that Charlemagne was surprised by the event. That had he known the Pope intended to crown him, he would not have entered the church. Can we accept that the greatest political moment of the early Middle Ages occurred in stealth? That an emperor was crowned without witnesses, without preparation, without documentation? This silence is more than strange, it is strategic. The notion that Charlemagne was crowned Emperor of the Romans revives an idea long dead. The last Western Roman emperor had fallen over 3 centuries prior. To resurrect the title was not a neutral act. It was a political weapon, one aimed at Byzantium. In Constantinople, the Empress Irene ruled alone after blinding her son. She was controversial, but she was recognized as the Ramayan sovereign. The Byzantine court saw itself as the sole heir of Roman authority. To crown Charlemagne in Rome was a challenge, a duplication, a false echo. Yet Byzantine sources treat the event with indifference. Some reject it outright. Others don't mention it at all. How can such a rupture in imperial legitimacy receive so little reaction? Unless it wasn't a rupture, but a later invention. The title Imperator Romanorum appears inconsistently in early documents. Charlemagne used various forms: King of the Franks, Patricius Romanorum, Emperor governing the Roman Empire. But the full forceful title does not crystallize until later under Louis the Pious and his successors. The idea that this title was granted on a single winter morning in 800 may be a retroactive myth built to lend sacred weight to an evolving political structure. Look closely at the Liber Pontificalis, the Papal Chronicle. The section describing Leo III is vague about the coronation. The passage is more theological than historical, presenting the Pope's role as divinely guided rather than politically deliberate. There is no detail, no description of the crown, the liturgy, the acclamation. We are left with inference, not report. More suspicious still are the later adaptations of the event. By the 11th and 12th centuries, the coronation becomes a liturgical archetype. Writers describe it in elaborate detail. The hymns sung, the gestures performed, the very words spoken. But these embellishments arrive long after the fact, as if the memory had to be built from imagination, not experience. It is in this gap that fabrication festers. Could the coronation have been backdated to give Otto III's own reign greater legitimacy? Otto was crowned in Rome in 996. His imperial pretensions were vast. If he and Pope Sylvester II sought to construct a lineage of imperial Christian rulers, they needed a beginning, a founding moment. And Charlemagne, already venerated as a Christian king, became the chosen genesis. Even Charlemagne's relics suggest manipulation. In the year 1000, Otto III famously opened Charlemagne's tomb. What he found or claimed to find was astonishing. The emperor's body incorrupt, seated on a throne, holding a gospel and a scepter. The image is theatrical, apocalyptic, messianic. But this scene mirrors medieval hagiography, not history. No tomb resists time so cleanly. Was the body staged? Was it even Charlemagne's? Coins minted during Charlemagne's reign also failed to depict imperial grandeur. Most bear the name Carolus and a simple cross, no crown, no orb, no imperial regalia. The image of the emperor is conspicuously absent. Compare this to later Holy Roman emperors, whose coinage proudly proclaims their imperial status. Why the restraint unless the title was uncertain or undeserved? We must also question the context of 800 itself. Europe, we are told, was still healing from centuries of fragmentation. But where are the marks of such healing? No major building programs preceded the coronation. No legal reforms followed. No sweeping theological shifts occurred. The coronation, if real, changed nothing until later historians imbued it with meaning. The ritual of imperial coronation itself has no fixed form before the 11th century. Its liturgy was improvised, its symbolism inconsistent. This suggests that the memory of Charlemagne's anointing was less a preserved tradition than a constructed precedent. So what if the event was never meant to be remembered because it never occurred? What if the coronation of Charlemagne was not an event, but an insertion? A single elegant fiction around which a false chronology could be built. It would explain the silence. The contradictions, the lack of witnesses, the theological awkwardness, the political implausibility. It would explain why the earliest sources whisper, while the later ones sing, and it would affirm the deeper fear that not only were centuries added, but within them, symbolic keystones were crafted to hold the illusion in place. What is more powerful than forging a century? Forging an emperor to rule it. And if we once crowned a ghost, how many more phantoms rule over our history? Something is wrong with the stars. The ancients were master observers of the heavens. Babylonian astronomers could track eclipses centuries in advance. Egyptian temples were aligned with solstices. Islamic scholars mapped the lunar calendar with near-perfect precision. And even in the medieval West, monks recorded celestial phenomena with a kind of sacred urgency, seeing in them portents, omens, the very language of God. So why then do the skies refuse to align with the history we are told? When modern astronomers plot the dates of medieval eclipses, comets, and planetary conjunctions, a disquieting pattern emerges. Events recorded in 8th and 9th century chronicles often don't match the sky. Eclipses are among the most predictable events in the cosmos. Their timing and paths can be back-calculated with astonishing accuracy using computer simulations of Earth's rotation. And yet, records from supposed Carolingian annals describe solar and lunar eclipses that, according to astronomy, either did not happen or happened years, sometimes decades, earlier or later. Consider the Anno Regni Francorum, a key source for the Carolingian period. It mentions a solar eclipse in 807 that darkened the land at midday. But when we consult astronomical tables, no total solar eclipse was visible in Frankish territory that year. The closest candidate visible over France was in 804, 3 years out of sync. One could dismiss this as a scribal error, a mistake of memory, a transposition of digits, but the errors repeat. A lunar eclipse recorded in 828 does not correspond to any known celestial event. A comet described in 837 is 2 years out of phase with Chinese records. The very sky seems to bend around the narrative, not the other way around. Why would multiple scribes in different locations consistently misdate the heavens? Unless the timeline they were copying was itself altered and they were retrofitting the stars to match. This is more than an astronomical anomaly. It is a forensic crack in the chronology. Calendars, like texts, can be forged, but the heavens cannot. And yet, we find ourselves trying to reconcile the unreconcilable Easter calculations. For instance, depended on the computous and intricate set of lunar and solar cycles. Medieval scholars prided themselves on predicting the correct date for Easter decades in advance. Bede's De Temporum Ration outlines these methods. But when we apply modern astronomical data to the medieval Easter tables, discrepancies emerge. Years in which Easter was celebrated according to the moon, but not according to the moon's actual phases. In 831, for example, records suggest Easter was celebrated on March 27th, but astronomical models show that the Paschal full moon would have fallen on April 1st that year. The computus was wrong, or the year was wrong, or both. Now consider Halley's Comet, a celestial anchor that returns every 76 years. Chinese records of its appearance are remarkably consistent: 240 BC, 87 BC, 12 BC, 66 AD, and onward. European sources, however, begin to mention the comet inconsistently during the phantom centuries. A sighting in 837 matches Halley's trajectory, but no corresponding political or social upheaval is recorded. The West, it seems, saw the sign but did not respond. A silent comet in a silent world. Is this not strange? Especially when compared to later appearances. 1066. For instance, when the comet became a harbinger of conquest and chaos in the Bayeux Tapestry. Why did earlier sightings go unremarked or appear misaligned? Perhaps because they were inserted later added to lend legitimacy to a falsified era. Perhaps the scribes, retroactively writing the past, sought to anchor their narratives in the sky only to misplace the stars. The Islamic world, in contrast, offers a consistent celestial record. Scholars like al-Biruni and al-Sufi documented planetary motions, eclipses, and star catalogs that align well with modern data. The Hijri calendar, tied to lunar cycles, provides clean markers. When we compare Islamic and European astronomical records from the 8th to 10th centuries, a chronological gap yawns open. They do not align not only in date but in content. Events described in Baghdad are missing in Aachen. The sky looks different from each vantage point, not because of geography, but because of narrative construction. Even the Byzantine records offer contradiction. Leo the mathematician, a 9th century figure in Constantinople, wrote on astronomy and mechanics. Yet his models of celestial motion correspond more closely with Alexandrian systems of the 4th and 5th centuries. There is no clear progression, no line of evolution. Just a sudden re-emergence of ancient knowledge in a context that feels too late or too early. And what of the precession of the equinoxes? This slow wobble of Earth's axis, taking approximately 26,000 years to complete, shifts the position of stars over centuries. It is measurable, it is constant, and it can be used to date star maps and observations. When we compare star positions in medieval manuscripts with modern simulations, we find a discrepancy. The sky described in 800 AD corresponds more closely with the sky of 500 AD, as if those 3 centuries never passed. This is not conjecture. It is celestial mechanics. And yet, our textbooks refuse to budge. We are asked to believe that scribes were poor observers, that monks mistranscribed numbers, that multiple civilizations made the same mistakes across continents and centuries, or more disturbingly, we are asked not to notice. What if time itself has been stretched, warped, twisted to fit a theological calendar, an imperial ambition? What if the stars, indifferent and ancient, have remembered what we have been made to forget? And if the sky itself contradicts our history, why do we continue to trust the ground beneath our feet? A monastery is more than a place of prayer. It is a vault of memory. In an age before the printing press, before the nation-state, before central archives, it was the monks who became time's scribes. Their quills etched the passage of years into vellum, binding sacred ritual to earthly event. They chronicled births, deaths, eclipses, famines, floods, kings, and councils. The monastery was the axis around which history spun. So what does it mean when they stop writing? Across Europe, from the British Isles to the Alps, the monastic annals of the so-called Dark Ages grow strangely quiet between the 7th and 10th centuries. Not silent, exactly, but hushed. The entries become brief, formulaic, impersonal. Where once they overflowed with theological debates, local conflicts, visions, and miracles, now they reduce history to a litany of reigns and deaths. Why would men trained to read the signs of heaven and earth, who preserved the wisdom of Rome, translated Aristotle, and copied entire Bibles, suddenly lose interest in the details of the world? Consider the Annals of Fulda, a principal source for the 9th century. For several decades, its entries are reduced to mere fragments. The emperor traveled to Saxony. A famine occurred. There was an eclipse. These are not chronicles. They are scaffold and bare timbers erected to support the illusion of a lived past. In the Annals of Ulster, we see a similar pattern. The 7th century opens with vivid detail, describing plagues, battles, and portents. But by the mid-8th century, the entries thin, like breath fading from a body. Where did the complexity go? This is not consistent with crisis. Monasteries under siege often became more verbose, not less. Disasters, wars, heresies all invited theological reflection. The Chronicle of John of Biclaro in the 6th century written during Gothic and Roman conflict in Iberia, is rich with insight. Why, then, does a time of supposed imperial revival under Charlemagne and his heirs result in less, not more, historical output? Silence here is a signal, we are told, that literacy declined after the fall of Rome, that monastic scriptoria decayed. But how, then, do we explain the sudden resurgence of high-quality manuscripts by the 9th century produced in Carolingian minuscule, with precision and artistry? These monks could write. They had the skill. What they lacked was content. Or perhaps what they had was a script and were told to follow it. In some cases, entire years are skipped. The Anno Bertiniani, covering West Francia, omit multiple years with no comment. Did nothing happen? Or was nothing permitted to be recorded? Even more disturbing are the duplicated events. In both the Annals of St. Gall and the Royal Frankish Annals, the same events appear sometimes word for word at different years. A battle in 742 is replicated in 754, a famine in 769 mirrors, one in 782. These are not echoes of reality. They are copy-pasted inserts, used to populate an empty timeline. Why would monks do this? Because they were under pressure. Charlemagne and his successors demanded a history worthy of their empire. A sacred lineage had to be created, stretching from the Roman Caesars to the crowned heads of Europe. The church needed continuity. The empire needed legitimacy. And so, the monks became architects not of memory, but of myth. Forgery was institutionalized. At the Abbey of Corbie, scholars produced the Pseudo-Isidorian Decretals, a massive compilation of papal letters, many of them forged. Their goal? To enhance the authority of bishops and the Pope. These texts were inserted into the past like seeds in fertile soil, growing into the roots of canon law. The monks of Corbie were not deceived. They were not ignorant. They were strategic. If papal letters could be fabricated, why not annals? The very structure of these chronicles gives them away. They are written in hindsight, often decades later. They contain post-event interpretations. The voices are not those of contemporaries, but of curators. The past is curated, framed, polished. In the gaps. Oh, the gaps. The Annals of Metz leave a 20-year lacuna with only a note. In these years, little is known. This from a monastery at the heart of the Carolingian world during the reign of Louis the Pious, a time of supposed theological ferment, dynastic conflict, and imperial expansion. Little is known, or little was permitted to be known. Even the language of the chronicles shifts. Where once monks used Latin infused with local color Gaulish, Gothic, Frankish terms, we now see sterile, uniform Latin. It is the language of bureaucracy, not witness. The past is no longer lived, it is administered. And then, there are the chronicles that retroactively extend themselves. The Chronicle of Fredegar, written in the 7th century, was later interpolated to include material from the 8th and 9th. Scholars have identified different hands, different inks, different intentions. The text grew accreted, not authored. Was it adapting to new realities? Or was it absorbing the timeline created by others, aligning itself with the forged flow of time? Outside Europe, silence is not found. In the Abbasid Caliphate, in Tang, China, in Buddhist India, chronicles remain lively. Events are rich, dates consistent, voices distinct. These societies were not silent. Only the Christian West dims its lamp for these centuries. Only here does memory fade. And only here does that fading benefit an empire that needed space to grow its myth. An empire born of a coronation no one saw, ruled by an emperor no one described, documented by monks who copied more than they witnessed. If history is memory, and memory has been scripted, then what we call chronicles may be closer to theater. What, then, do we call the centuries they pretend to describe? And if the scribes were silent, who spoke in their place? Relics are not just remnants, they are anchors of belief. a splinter of the true cross, a vial of sacred blood, the bones of apostles. They are said to ground the intangible in the physical, the divine in the earthly. In the Middle Ages, relics became spiritual currency. Cathedrals were built to house them. Pilgrims traveled continents to venerate them. Wars were waged in their name. But among these sacred objects lie contradictions, chronological ruptures that refuse to be buried. How do you possess a relic of an event that had not yet occurred? The most venerated relic in Christendom is the true cross, the very timber upon which Christ was crucified. By the 4th century, Helena, mother of emperor Constantine, was said to have discovered it in Jerusalem. From there, fragments proliferated across Europe. By the 8th and 9th centuries, churches from France to Saxony claimed to house slivers of this sacred wood. Yet this diffusion raises unsettling questions. Why are so many of these relics first documented during the Phantom centuries? Churches in Tours, Aachen and Fulda all claim relics of the cross by the mid-9th century. And yet, earlier chronicles are silent. Not until these centuries, coinciding with the supposed reign of Charlemagne and the formation of the Carolingian Church, do these objects gain prominence. They arrive not gradually, not organically, but in a burst of coordinated legitimacy. Relics, like saints, needed stories. And many of those stories appear suspiciously late. Saint Maurice, for example, the patron of the Holy Roman Empire's military, was said to be a Roman commander martyred in the 3rd century. Yet his cult only begins to flourish in the 8th and 9th centuries, especially under the Ottonians. His lance, sword, and bones appear in European treasuries as sacred tokens. But his hagiography is thin, derivative, lacking early witnesses. Did Maurice exist? Or was he manufactured to provide divine sanction to a militarized Christian empire? Even more troubling are the Marian relics. The Virgin Mary's veil, robe, belt each appears in different cathedrals during the same Phantom period. Chartres Cathedral, a jewel of Gothic architecture, claims to possess the Sancta Chamasia, a tunic worn by Mary. This relic allegedly arrived in the 9th century, gifted by Charles the Bald, but no contemporary source confirms the gift. The relic simply appears along with its legend. If relics emerge in the record only after centuries of silence, what anchors their authenticity? Take the Holy Lance said to have pierced Christ's side. It was rediscovered multiple times. In medieval history, once in Antioch during the First Crusade, 1098, once in Vienna in the 10th century, and again in Rome. Each lance bore legitimacy. Each was claimed to be the original. Yet they contradict each other in provenance and age. And still, each served to validate the empire or papacy that held it. When an object emerges without a clear chain of custody, centuries after the fact, is it evidence or invention? Even the bones of the apostles tell different stories. Relics of St. Peter and St. Paul, said to rest beneath Rome, were also venerated in Constantinople and Trier. Churches in France claimed to possess their fingers or skulls. The duplication was not troubling to medieval minds, because faith, not forensics, governed authenticity. But to the historian, it suggests something else, that relics were deployed as instruments of power, not remnants of truth. And if these relics were forged, then so too may have been the history that surrounded them. Many relics are accompanied by inventions, narratives of their miraculous discovery. These texts often appear in the 9th century, written by monks or bishops seeking to elevate their institutions. The relic is found in a dream. It is uncovered during construction. A saint appears and reveals the hidden treasure. But curiously, these revelations often coincide with the foundation of new churches or the rise of new powers. In St. Denis, for instance, relics of St. Denis and his companions were discovered just as the abbey gained royal patronage. In Aachen, relics of the Virgin and various martyrs were gathered to support Charlemagne's imperial chapel. In each case, The relic's arrival matches political necessity. Why would a fragment of the cross arrive just as an emperor needs divine sanction? Why would apostolic bones surface as papal authority expands? Because relics are not just sacred, they are chronological tools. They provide physical proof of an ancient lineage, a tangible link to apostolic origins. And in a world where written records were thin, they became the scaffolding upon which centuries could be draped. To possess a relic was to possess time, to hold continuity in your hands. Yet some relics betray the illusion. In the 12th century, Peter the Venerable challenged the authenticity of certain relics, noting that multiple churches claimed the same object. His voice was rare. Most dared not question the sacred. But even within the church, unease grew. The Chronicon of Regino of Prum, written in 915, includes references to relics whose origins he could not trace. He describes sacred things of uncertain antiquity. That admission, slight, almost hidden, betrays a doubt most scribes would never voice. And then there are the missing relics. If the 7th to 9th centuries were so pious, why do we find so few pilgrimage records? Why so few accounts of miracles, processions, healings? The great relic cults of the later Middle Ages are absent in this period. It is not until the 11th century that relic worship explodes into social life. Were the relics simply sleeping? Or were they inserted retroactively, backdated to a phantom time? Even in the East, the contradictions accumulate. Constantinople claimed to possess the robe of Christ, the crown of thorns, and the mandalion, yet these relics appear only in later Byzantine sources, often during times of crisis. When empires needed legitimacy, the relics emerged. Is this faith or theater? And if a cross appears before a crusade, if a saint's body is found without a death, if a veil is venerated centuries before its mention, then what of the time surrounding them? If the relic is real, but its history is false, what then is the relic? And if a world can be built upon such objects, how many centuries stand atop a splinter of wood that was never there? They ruled, but they left no footprints. History, at its core, is the record of succession. Who ruled after whom, which bloodlines endured, which crowns passed from head to head. Dynasties define epochs. They anchor time in the names of kings, queens, emperors, and dukes. Their marriages stitched alliances. Their deaths split empires. They were buried with pomp, inscribed in stone, remembered in law. So how do we explain the kings who reigned for decades and left no bones? The early medieval period, particularly between the 7th and 10th centuries, is cluttered with royal names whose lives are known almost entirely from regnal lists. Sigeric, Sigebert, Theuderic, Chilperic, Carloman. Their names flicker in annals, charters, and genealogies, but flicker only. The deeper one looks, the more spectral they become. Take Carloman I, the brother of Charlemagne. He supposedly ruled half of the Frankish realm from 768 until his sudden death in 771. Contemporary sources are few. The Anno Regni Francorum mention him with mechanical brevity. His tomb is lost, his body never found. There is no known seal, no surviving charter bearing his name alone. Only documents shared with Charlemagne, documents that may have been amended later. Why does the brother of Europe's founding emperor leave no independent trace? Then there is Childeric III, the last Merovingian king, deposed in 751 to make way for the Carolingians. We are told he was tonsured and exiled to a monastery, a quiet, symbolic transfer of power. Yet his life is a mystery. No reliable portrait exists. His tomb is unknown. No writings describe his exile. His deposition appears almost too perfect, as if scripted to retroactively justify the rise of Pepin, the short dot in dynastic history. Transitions are rarely clean. Civil wars, disputed heirs, regional claimants, these are the norm. Yet during The phantom centuries, succession flows unusually smooth. Lineages pass predictably, even when monarchs die young or reign briefly. This is not politics. It is hagiography. More troubling still is the case of the Lombards. The Lombard kingdom in Italy, which supposedly ruled from the 6th to 8th centuries, lists over 20 kings. But archaeological confirmation of these rulers is inconsistent at best. Queen Theodelinda, one of the most significant Lombard figures, is known from a handful of sources, most written centuries later. Her palace is lost. Her artifacts are disputed. Her cult is localized and suspiciously synchronized with Carolingian interests. Why would an entire royal house vanish into mist? The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms show a similar fog. Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, each provides long regnal lists from Bede and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. But for many of the 8th and 9th century kings, there are no coins, no confirmed burials, no contemporary descriptions. The Chronicle itself, compiled in the 9th century, was created under Alfred the Great, a king in need of a glorious ancestry. Could it be that he or his court constructed that ancestry? The name Cadwalla surfaces a king of Wessex who ruled briefly in the late 7th century. He converts to Christianity, abdicates the throne, and dies in Rome. It is a neat narrative. A pagan king becomes a pilgrim. But the trail ends with the story. No tomb, no charter. Only the echo of a moral tale. Even in Scandinavia, where sagas preserve memory in oral form, the early kings are shadowed. Semi-divine, often indistinguishable from myth. Harold Wartooth, Ivar the Boneless. Kings who bridge legend and history. But the gap is wide. We have swords, we have runes. We have ships buried in soil, but dates, dynasties? Not until later when Christianity arrives in writing with it. And what of the Capetians? They emerge at the end of the 10th century, with Hugh Capet crowned in 987, but his immediate predecessors, the Robertians, are dim. Robert I, Hugh, the great men of power, but sparsely documented. Their rise coincides with the decline of the Carolingians, as though one myth was ending and another beginning. The transition feels orchestrated, prepared. Could these be artificial dynasties? Historical fillers constructed to bridge one empire to the next? Coins bearing their names are often ambiguous. A single Hagonist as denarius could belong to multiple. Genealogies contradict themselves. Monasteries attribute the same ancestor to different houses. It is not a family tree, it is a lattice of convenient alignments. The Ottonian dynasty ruling from Saxony presents similar problems. Otto I is a towering figure, but his grandfather Liudolf remains a phantom. Few documents mention him. His wife Oda is known mostly from later hagiographies. The roots of the dynasty are shallow, but the crown rests heavily upon them. Even the bones are uncooperative. Royal tombs from this era are often empty. In St. Denis, in Aachen, in Metz, graves have been exhumed, examined, and questioned. Sarcophagi contain no inscriptions. Remains are jumbled, mismatched, or missing entirely. In several cases, DNA analysis has been inconclusive and radioisotope dating suggests different timelines than expected. Can an empire be built on unburied kings? We assume that succession ensures authenticity, that each ruler validates the next. But if one link in the chain is false, the whole line becomes suspect. And in the phantom centuries, that chain rattles with every step. If these dynasties were forged, who forged them? Monasteries had motive to legitimize the land grants and privileges given by kings. To have received a charter from Childeric III or Carloman I was to be immune from taxes. Even if those kings were gone, the parchment remained. The church needed to validate those gifts. So scribes backdated rulers, created deeds, invented seals. The empire needed fathers. The church needed sons. Together, they filled the gaps with royal names, each a placeholder in the void of time. This was not fraud. It was foundation. What better way to build an empire than to claim it had always been there? And if entire dynasties were scripted constructed, with quill and wax and liturgy, how much of history is genealogy, and how much is genealogy by design? What if the kings we remember never lived? And if those who ruled the past were phantoms, who rules us now? Beneath their crowns? Historians are the keepers of memory. But who keeps the historians? We imagine the chronicler as an impartial scribe, faithfully recording the passage of time. Yet in the medieval world, the historian was not free. He was a monk under oath, a servant of lords, a tool of ecclesiastical power. He wrote not to question, but to confirm. Not to illuminate, but to legitimize. And in the silent centuries, between 614 and 911, the historians obeyed. The obedience was subtle at first. Take Einhard, Charlemagne's biographer. His Vita Caroli Magni is praised as a seminal medieval work, a key source for understanding the man hailed as Father of Europe. But the text reads less like a biography and more like a eulogy. Charlemagne's conquests are framed as divine necessity. His physical features are described in idealized Roman terms. Even his faults are cloaked in virtue. There is no scrutiny, no conflict, no contemporaries voicing dissent. Einhard wrote not for truth, but for posterity. Is it biography or beatification? This pattern repeats across the Carolingian world. The royal Frankish annals, compiled under Louis the Pious, present an unbroken series of Christian victories and dynastic certainties. Defeats are omitted, scandals silenced. The narrative is smooth too. Smooth, as if it were constructed not from experience, but from instruction. In some cases, obedience becomes outright fiction. Consider the Liber Historia Francorum, a 727 chronicle blending Merovingian lore with Carolingian ambition. It connects Frankish kings to Trojan heroes, echoing the Roman foundation myth. Why? Because empires need myths of origin, and the historian, if obedient, delivers them. The Franks, illiterate for centuries, suddenly gain an ancestry. Their kings gain gravitas. The people gain destiny. And the timeline gains padding. In Anglo-Saxon England, Bede is remembered as a beacon of early medieval scholarship. His ecclesiastical history remains a cornerstone of British historiography. But even Bede, devout and precise, was obedient. His timeline is built around calculating Easter, aligning Christian events with imperial rhythms. He introduces the Anno Domini system, not merely as a dating tool, but as a theological clock, placing Christ at the center of time. This was not a neutral act. It was a recalibration of history itself. Once the AD system gained traction, past events had to be aligned to its axis. This meant inserting dates, estimating lifespans, assigning years to unrecorded reigns. Bede filled the gaps, not with certainty, but with symmetry. Chronology became theology. Time became liturgy. And so the scribes followed suit. In the 9th century, the Chronicle of Moissac appeared, another obedient document, aligning Frankish victories with divine will. It backdates rulers. It reinterprets battles. It synchronizes history with prophecy. The pattern is unmistakable. The past is rewritten to serve the present. One must ask, who gave the orders? Monasteries were not independent. They were bound by royal patronage, papal directives, and episcopal oversight. A monk who wrote against the grain risked excommunication or worse. When Louis the Pious fell into disgrace, multiple chronicles revised their tone. Some erased praise, others inserted caution. The narrative bent to the shifting winds of court favor. In a world where parchment was scarce and copying laborious, nothing was written by accident. Even the omissions are loud. Why do so few chronicles of the 8th and 9th centuries mention Byzantium? Why are Eastern emperors often ignored or treated as heretics? Why do Islamic scholars flourishing in Baghdad and Cordoba vanish from Western narratives? Because history, like geography, was redrawn. The obedient historian did not write what happened. He wrote what was necessary. What if an entire layer of the historical record, those phantom centuries, was produced by such obedience? What if Otto III and Pope Sylvester II, in their millennial ambitions, commanded their scribes to create a Christian empire's prehistory, to stretch the lineage of Charlemagne backward, to fill the dark centuries with saints, kings, battles, and councils, to stitch a seamless robe where once there was only threadbare cloth? They would not have done it alone. The monasteries would have complied. The bishops would have approved. The emperors would have funded the scriptoria. And the scribes, obedient as ever, would have copied, amended, interpolated, invented one document at a time. Even the use of chronologies like the Annals of Xanten and Annals of Lorsch shows signs of such coordination. Events are recorded across monasteries with uncanny symmetry. Not just the same battles, but the same phrases, the same dates, the same script. Are these shared memories or distributed mandates? There are anomalies in the handwriting itself. Paleographers have noted that certain script styles, believed to be from different decades, appear in the same document. That certain parchments were rewritten, their dates altered. Some chronicles skip reigns entirely, only to reinsert them later under a new guise. What is this, if not editorial control? The obedient historian, then, is not just a witness, but an instrument. When the empire needed continuity, he provided genealogy. When the church needed precedent, he delivered counsels. When the pope needed lineage, he crafted apostolic succession. And when the 10th century needed a past, he gave them 3 centuries of it. But obedience has consequences. Once forged, these centuries had to be protected. Later historians took them at face value. Charters were built on them. Legal rights encoded them. Architecture referenced them. Saints arose within them. To question them became dangerous, not only spiritually, but politically. And so, the illusion calcified. We read these texts today as though they are windows into a vanished world. But what if they are mirrors? What if they reflect not the past but the desires of those who wrote them? And if the historians obeyed, who among them disobeyed? Where are the pages that contradicted? The scribes who resisted? The versions that were erased? What if they were never allowed to write at all? Stone does not lie. Or so we believe. We trust ruins to tell us the truth when texts falter. A wall, a bridge, a crypt, these are taken as proof of life and labor, of society and structure. We date civilizations by their mortar. We infer power by the height of their arches. But what happens when stone tells a story that no one remembers living? In the heart of Western Europe, structures stand that cannot be accounted for, not because they are too old, but because they are too sophisticated for the era that supposedly produced them. They are ruins without records, monuments without momentum. They rise from soil like dreams fossilized in limestone. Consider the aqueduct of Spoleto, in central Italy, also known as the Ponte del Torre. Officially, it was built in the 13th century on Roman foundations. But multiple architectural historians, including some in the early 20th century, proposed that its lower structure was pre-Roman, possibly dating to late antiquity or even earlier. The issue? No records describe its construction. No papal or imperial documents mention it before the late Middle Ages. And yet, its engineering surpasses many works from the time of its supposed reconstruction. What civilization built it, and why did it vanish? Bridges, too, offer mute contradictions. The Devil's Bridge in Surette, France, constructed in the early 14th century, was long thought to be of Carolingian origin due to its advanced arch and size. Similar structures across France, Spain, and Germany bear the same nickname, Devil's Bridges, attributed to folklore explaining how such feats of engineering could have been achieved by mere mortals. The real reason? The techniques seemed too refined, the labor too coordinated. For the chaotic world of early medieval Europe, who was building these things, and where did they go afterward? Architecture demands infrastructure. Quarries, scaffolding, skilled masons, geometry, planning, tools. These are not ad hoc endeavors. And yet, many of these constructions are isolated, no evidence of surrounding urban growth, no records of workshops, no follow-up buildings showing a stylistic progression. They appear like monoliths, singular, stateless, strangely detached from any architectural lineage. The crypt of Saint-Germain-d'Auxerre, for instance, contains elements vaulting, column design, ornamental patterning that scholars struggle to place firmly within the 9th century. There's no surviving documentation of its construction. It does not resemble buildings before or immediately after it. It is a silent anomaly. Are these anomalies evidence of hidden sophistication? Or are they remnants from a different time altogether, structures retrofitted into a forged chronology? Let us look beyond churches and aqueducts. Look to the roads. Roman. Roads are found beneath nearly every major European city. But during the supposed centuries of 614 to 911, new roads are scarce. Almost no major civil infrastructure is dated confidently to this period. Settlements become disconnected. Trade routes falter. And yet, some cathedrals and fortifications appear to rise with logistical efficiency, material moved, stone delivered, foundations laid with coordination. How? Without functioning roads or centralized logistics, how does one construct a cathedral? Take the case of Corvey Abbey in Germany, founded in the early 9th century. Its westwork and elaborate entrance structure is unique, massive, and atypical of the time. No other examples exist until centuries later, in the Romanesque period. Scholars have long debated whether the Corvey westwork was an innovation or a survival. But if there are no intermediate forms, no experimentation, and no nearby influence, we must ask, was it built then at all? Or was it dated to support a narrative? Chronology in architecture is not just visual. It depends on contextual dating. Inscriptions, charters, burials, reused spolia. And all of these, we have seen, can be manipulated. If a building contains a relic supposedly discovered in 850, then the building must be post-850. But what if the relic is a forgery? The dating collapses. Romanesque buildings marked by thick walls, rounded arches, and minimal ornamentation are said to emerge around 1000 AD, yet several Carolingian churches display these same features. The Basilica of St. Richier in Ponthieu, destroyed but recorded, had a triple-aisled nave and a westwork predating its supposed emergence by 2 centuries. These structures seem to belong to a different time, not as precursors but as contemporaries misplaced in the chronology. Architecture is cumulative. Styles evolve. But the early medieval record shows sudden appearances, isolated brilliance, followed by silence. This is not evolution. It is spasm. Even in urban planning, dissonance reigns. Towns like Quedlinburg and Regensburg boast grid patterns, drainage systems, and building foundations that suggest Roman or late antique origins. Yet they are attributed to Carolingian expansion. No transition is documented. The urbanism simply reappears. It is as if the wheel had to be rediscovered, but somehow re-emerged fully intact. Are we seeing the remnants of a Roman world that never fully collapsed? Or are we seeing architectural artifacts misdated to fill a temporal gap? In some sites, newer buildings were literally constructed atop older ones, palimpsests of stone. But often, the dating of both layers is murky. When archaeologists dig beneath a 10th century chapel and find a 5th century bathhouse. They label the Middle Centuries as poorly understood. But what if those centuries do not exist? Is the absence of architecture a reflection of cultural decline? Or is it the architectural record revealing a falsified narrative? And what of the laborers? Large-scale construction requires hundreds of masons, quarrymen, carpenters, overseers. Yet tax records, census logs, and provisioning accounts are nearly absent from this era. No economic model exists to explain how such labor was organized and funded. The people who built these places do not exist in the textual record. So who raised these walls? Were they reused Roman structures mistakenly dated? Were they built centuries earlier or later than claimed? Or were they constructed in the 10th or 11th century, then backdated to manufacture a Carolingian Golden Age? If so, then stone does lie. And if the stones lie of cathedrals, abbeys, and aqueducts were assigned false birthdays, what happens to the centuries those structures are meant to prove? What remains of history when even its foundations are forged? Every civilization encodes itself in law. Legal codes are more than rules, they are mirrors of power, records of governance, and declarations of what a society fears, values, and punishes. Law leaves behind a paper trail: edicts, codices, charters, fines, judgments. Through law, we track the evolution of rights, the contours of state authority, the emergence of institutions. And yet, between the 7th and 10th centuries, the law goes strangely quiet, not absent, just eerily still. We are told that during this period spanning the Merovingian tale, the rise of the Carolingians, and the forging of the Holy Roman Empire, Europe was governed by codes both Roman and Germanic. The Lex Salica, the Lex Ripuaria, the Capitulary of Charlemagne, these are held up as examples of continuity. But upon inspection, they disintegrate. Let us begin with the Lex Salica, attributed to Clovis I in the early 6th century. This Frankish code was supposedly copied and expanded under Charlemagne. The Lex Salica Emendata, the revised version, is dated to the early 9th century, but none of the original manuscripts survive. All we possess are 10th and 11th century copies, each slightly different, none definitive. Scholars have long argued whether the laws reflect actual practice or idealized structure, but what if they reflect neither? What if they were retroactively constructed, not to govern the present, but to give weight to a fictional past? Law, after all, is performative. If a code is cited in a charter, that code must be older. If a king claims descent from a lawgiver, that lawgiver must be anchored in history. By inserting law codes into the phantom centuries, rulers like Otto III and ecclesiastical scribes like Gerbert of Aurelak could create the appearance of continuous governance. An empire not born, but reborn. Not imposed, but restored. The Capitulary of Charlemagne is another problem. This compilation of royal decrees, religious reforms, economic policies, and military orders exists in fragments. There is no single, authoritative manuscript. Many of its provisions, when examined closely, seem to echo earlier Roman law or later canonical regulation. Some scholars suggest they are unrealistic, too advanced for the era. Others believe they were copied from older models, updated to suit a 9th century worldview. But what if they were copied in the other direction? What if the so-called Carolingian capitularies were produced in the 10th or 11th centuries, then backdated and ascribed to Charlemagne to create a legal foundation for contemporary reforms? The Church certainly had motive. Canon law in the 11th and 12th centuries underwent significant expansion. To legitimize new papal authority, legal continuity was essential. By planting laws in the Carolingian past, the Church could argue, these are not innovations, they are restorations. And if law could be restored, so too could empire. Even the format of the laws raises questions. Roman legal documents followed strict formulae: name, title, date, place, witness, seal. Early medieval charters often mimic these forms, but inconsistently. Some include formulas not in use until centuries later. Others reference offices that likely didn't exist at the time. Take the Missi Dominici, royal envoys said to be dispatched by Charlemagne to ensure justice across the empire. They are mentioned in several capitularies, but no personal names survive, no records of their actions, no complaints filed, no appeals logged, no correspondence preserved. How can such an expansive legal institution leave behind no bureaucratic trace? In England, too, legal continuity is suspicious. King Alfred the Great is credited with creating the Doom Book, a compilation of Mosaic law, Christian ethics, and traditional Saxon custom. But its only surviving copies date centuries later, and much of its content mirrors continental texts, notably Carolingian ones. The flow of influence may be reversed. Was Alfred preserving law or importing a forged framework from across the Channel? Charters' legal grants of land and privilege are even more precarious. Most early medieval charters survive in cartularies, bound collections created in the 11th and 12th centuries. But internal inconsistencies abound. Names are duplicated. Witnesses appear in multiple charters years apart without aging. Some charters are dated using calendars that postdate their supposed issuance. Others reference saints or relics whose veneration did not yet exist. Are these scribal errors, or are they traces of fabrication? We are told that in the 8th and 9th centuries, kings and monasteries engaged in a flurry of legal activity, exchanging lands, confirming rights, imposing fines. But the distribution is odd. Whole regions go untouched. Certain abbeys, like St. Denis or Fulda, produce dozens of charters. Others, equally prominent, produce none. This is not diversity. This is construction, where legal texts exist, they exist densely. Elsewhere void, like spotlights on a darkened stage, illuminating only what the director desires. Even the legal vocabulary betrays suspicion. The word imperium, for instance, is used in some documents long after the fall of the Roman Empire. Inconsistently, it appears in documents ascribed to Charlemagne, but is absent from others in the same year. Titles such as Rex, Patricius, and Imperator fluctuate in meaning and use more in tune with 10th century political needs than with 8th century reality. Could it be that these terms were assigned later, to build a legal bridge between the real and the imagined? Forgery was not a crime in medieval scriptoria, it was a tool. Monks produced charters confirming land their abbey had always owned, but never documented. Bishops created bulls proving their see's apostolic foundation. Popes ratified decrees they had never seen to bolster the Church's timeless authority. These were not seen as lies, but as sacred truths told after the fact. If the land is truly ours, should it not always have been? If the emperor truly reigns, should he not have always reigned? The result is a legal landscape filled with ghost rulers, who reigned but never judged, judges who ruled but never lived, laws that bound a society that never existed. The written word, meant to preserve order, became the ink that bound illusion to fact. And if law itself, our clearest record of temporal authority, was used to validate a fabricated time, then what remains to protect us from the architects of the imaginary? What justice is possible when the very scrolls of justice were composed in a theater of shadows? Christendom, unified in faith, divided in time. We are told that the Christian world, stretching from the Gaelic monasteries of Ireland to the opulent basilicas of Byzantium, was a single body, fractured but breathing the same theological air. Yet the further we examine the phantom centuries, the more Christendom appears, not unified, but dislocated. Events don't align, reforms occur out of sequence. Councils contradict one another. The ecclesiastical clock ticks out of sync on Either side of the Latin-Greek divide. Was the Church splintered by doctrine or by a manufactured timeline? Let us begin with the Council of Constantinople in 869 to 870, often referred to as the Fourth Ecumenical Council in the West. Its purpose? To condemn Photius, the Patriarch of Constantinople, and reaffirm papal authority. But the East never accepted its legitimacy. The Orthodox Church instead recognizes the Council of 879 to 880, which reinstated Photius and subtly rebuked Rome. So which council was real? Both claim authority. Both cite precedent. But only one fits the papal narrative of uninterrupted supremacy. The other affirms a rival chronology, one in which Byzantium remained dominant, Rome peripheral. Could the phantom centuries, those silent, awkward years, have been stitched in part to elevate the papacy above its eastern competitors? Pope Nicholas I, reigning from 858 to 867, is a pivotal figure in this transformation. He asserted the Pope's right to intervene in secular affairs, challenged the marriage of Lothair II, and confronted Photius directly. He is, in many ways, the first modern pope. And yet, the sources describing him are limited, contradictory, and suspiciously consistent with later papal reforms. Is Nicholas a forerunner of papal absolutism or a retroactive blueprint for it? Even the documentation surrounding his reign, the false decretals, was forged. These texts, attributed to early popes and councils, aimed to increase episcopal and papal authority. Scholars now agree they were fabricated in the 9th century. But why then? Why this sudden, urgent need to create a pseudo-legal archive of church power? Because the church needed continuity. And continuity needed scaffolding. Enter the forged centuries. By inserting councils, papal decrees, and ecclesiastical controversies into the phantom timeline, the Vatican could claim an unbroken tradition stretching back to Peter. Disputes with the East could be framed as deviations, not debates. Authority could be shown as ancient rather than emergent. But Byzantium kept its own records. And those records tell a different story. The Byzantine patriarchs, Methodius, Ignatius, Photius, operate on a rhythm that defies the Western clock. Their correspondence, their theological treatises, their imperial entanglements all point to a world in which time flowed differently. The imperial court in Constantinople recorded solar eclipses, plagues, and diplomatic missions that have no counterpart in Western annals. The schism was not only ecclesial, it was temporal. The filioque controversy, whether the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father alone or from the Father and the Son, supposedly grew over centuries. But its presence in Western creeds appears suddenly and inconsistently. In some regions, it is recited by the 8th century. In others, not until the 11th. And in Eastern sources, it is barely mentioned until the final rupture in 1054. Were these variations organic? Or imposed? What if the liturgical divergence was not a drift, but a design? A product of retroactive editing, introducing doctrinal differences into the phantom centuries to foreshadow the later schism. Even the saints do not align. Rome canonized saints unknown to the East. The East preserved the memory of ascetics and bishops unrecognized by the West. Calendars diverged. Feast days shifted. In some cases, the same figure is commemorated on different dates with different narratives. Was this the natural outgrowth of distance or the side effect of competing chronologies? Consider the cult of Saint Benedict. His rule became the foundation of Western monasticism, we are told, flourishing especially during the 8th and 9th centuries. Yet the earliest manuscripts of the rule appear in the Carolingian period, without traceable predecessors. Eastern monasticism, in contrast, had documented lineages to the Typicon, an evolving liturgical book. But the two systems are largely incompatible. How did the Benedictine model become so dominant in the West, so isolated from the East? Was it because it represented real divergence? Or because it was constructed to fill a vacuum? We must ask, too, how the papacy grew so suddenly. By the 11th century, the Pope claimed authority over kings, empires, doctrine, and war. But prior to the phantom centuries, the Bishop of Rome was merely primus inter pares, first among equals. The bishops of Alexandria, Antioch, and Constantinople wielded equal or greater power. For papal primacy to arise organically, it would have required centuries of development. But what if those centuries were inserted? The phantom time may not simply be a gap. It may be a space engineered to legitimize the Vatican's ascendance, a space into which forged councils, interpolated decrees, saintly legends, and liturgical reforms were planted, each reinforcing the illusion of inevitability. By doing so, the Church could claim that by the time of the Gregorian reforms, its supremacy was not new but ancient. That the Pope's authority was not political but prophetic. The Eastern Church, meanwhile, held to its own rhythm. The liturgical calendar of the Orthodox Church contains feast days and observances that cannot be mapped onto Western events. Icons portray saints with dates and epithets foreign to Latin hagiography. Was this divergence due to schism or to civil, chronological incoherence? If the East kept time differently, then our shared history fractures further. And if no single Christendom ever existed in unbroken harmony, then what we call Christian Europe is less a spiritual reality and more a political fabrication, a Rome-centered world, invented by scribes who needed centuries to justify their sovereignty. And if one part of Christendom was lifted above the other, by means of fiction rather than fact, then how many centuries of faith were built on a foundation laid by the quills of strategists? How much of God's time is actually man's invention? The collapse of empires is rarely silent. When peoples move, when tribes scatter, when borders shift, when civilizations fall, there is noise. Layers of ruins, ash in the soil, weapons left behind, languages intermingled. Historians trace these shifts through pottery shards, burial customs, genetic drift, and broken walls. Migration is tangible. So what does it mean when entire migrations vanish from the archaeological record? We are told that the early Middle Ages were shaped by the so-called migration period, a great churning of peoples after the fall of Rome. Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Lombards, Franks, Saxons, Angles, Slavs, Avars. They moved across Europe, carving new kingdoms from the corpse of the empire. But as we step into the phantom centuries, particularly between the 7th and 10th centuries, these migrations grow strangely opaque. The texts remain. The chronicles tell us of battles, invasions, alliances, but the land is mute. The graves do not multiply. The settlements do not shift. The genetic markers do not spread as they should. It is as if these great migrations, these tectonic shifts of peoples, never truly occurred. Let us begin with the Slavs. From the 6th to 9th centuries, we are told that Slavic tribes spread from the Carpathians to the Balkans and beyond, displacing or absorbing earlier populations. This expansion is considered one of the most significant demographic events in European history. And yet, early Slavic material culture is elusive. Archaeologists struggle to identify consistent Slavic burial types, housing structures, or agricultural patterns from this era. When such artifacts do appear, they are often sparse, isolated, and anachronistic. Is this a subtle migration, or a later settlement retroactively described as ancient? Consider also the Avars, a Central Asian people said to have invaded the Danube basin in the 6th century. They supposedly ruled a cognate for over 2 centuries, opposing the Franks and Byzantines alike. But the material culture of the Avars is fragmentary, limited to elite burials and isolated treasures, no large cities, no written language, no clear integration into the social fabric of Europe. And when Charlemagne defeated them in the late 8th century, their realm disappears almost overnight from both the maps and the ground. Was there ever an empire to begin with? The Anglo-Saxon Migration is another paradox. The traditional view holds that Angles, Saxons, and Jutes crossed from continental Europe into Britain in the 5th and 6th centuries, displacing the Romano-British population. But recent DNA studies complicate this view. While some Anglo-Saxon ancestry is detectable, the evidence suggests continuity, not displacement. In many areas, the local population appears genetically stable. Could it be that the migration was overstated or backdated to serve a narrative of conquest? The Franks themselves are a mystery. Their supposed expansion during the 7th to 9th centuries leaves behind few marks of demographic change. The burial customs remain largely consistent with earlier Gallo-Roman patterns. Language shifts slowly. Latin persists. No new ethnic identity imprints itself sharply on the land. Yet the texts written by obedient historians describe sweeping wars of expansion, resettlements, colonization. Could these be rhetorical inventions? Foundational myths of power? Even Viking migrations, which occurred at the end of the Phantom period, present odd lacunae. The Viking presence in England, Ireland, and France is well attested, but inconsistently. Some areas boast rich hoards and runestones. Others, where battles supposedly rage, show no archaeological trace. The Danelaw, a vast region of Viking control in England, lacks the structural transformation one might expect from such a deep cultural presence. Are we conflating raids with rule? Or are we misunderstanding time? If multiple migrations fail to appear in the physical record, perhaps the fault is not in the evidence, but in the chronology applied to that evidence. Archaeologists often date settlements and burials based on typology, the shape of pottery, the form of jewelry, the style of weapons. These are cross-referenced with historical chronologies derived from written sources. But if the written sources are themselves falsified or interpolated into a non-existent stretch of time, then archaeological dates too are distorted. The result: we assign events to the 8th century that may belong to the 5th, or to the 10th. We compress real migrations, extend them artificially, or invent them altogether. What of the Hungarian conquest? We are told that in 895, the Magyars entered the Carpathian Basin, establishing what would become modern Hungary. The narrative is detailed: 7 tribes, alliances, battles. But the archaeological footprint is abrupt. Large-scale settlement appears suddenly, with no clear migration trail leading up to it. Were the Magyars always there, rebranded by later scribes? Even more curiously, the Byzantine records of these migrations are inconsistent with Western ones. Where the Franks describe hordes pouring across rivers, the Byzantines often describe small bands, temporary incursions, shifting alliances. The mismatch is not only one of tone but of timeline. One side describes centuries, the other decades. Could it be that the migrations described in Western chronicles were not historical realities, but editorial insertions, used to explain demographic shifts that either happened earlier, later, or not at all? And if these tribes and peoples did not move as described, then what becomes of the states they are said to have founded? What if the kingdoms of early medieval Europe were not forged in the crucible of migration, but constructed in the scriptoria of monasteries, the chancelleries of emperors, and the councils of popes? A people named, a ruler invented, a conquest proclaimed, all to fill a gap in time that never existed. The land does not remember these migrations. So why do we? And who exactly gave us the memory? Chronology is the skeleton of history. Without it, events are weightless. Cause and effect dissolve. Empires float unmoored. And yet, when we place the timeline of Western Europe against those of the Islamic caliphates, the Byzantine Empire, or Tang China, the skeleton breaks. The bones do not align. The vertebrae of time, those critical years, turning points, reigns, and calamities collide. Or worse, they pass through each other like ghosts. If time is universal, Why does it fracture at the borders of Christendom? Let us begin with a celestial benchmark. The Islamic calendar, the Hijri, begins in 622 CE with the Prophet Muhammad's migration from Mecca to Medina. It is lunar, precise, and consistent. From that year forward, Islamic scholars recorded the movements of stars, kings, scholars, and traders with a density unmatched in the Christian West. Their scholars in Baghdad, Cairo, Cordoba wrote prodigiously preserving Greek science, advancing medicine, charting the heavens, yet their texts often make no mention of European figures that dominate Western chronology. Where are the Franks? Charlemagne the emperor who supposedly ruled most of Western Europe, crowned by the Pope in 800 barely registers in Islamic chronicles. Al-Khwarizmi, the great mathematician writing under Caliph Al-Ma'an in the 9th century, discusses Ptolemy and Indian astronomy, but not the Christian emperor who ruled just beyond the Mediterranean. Ibn Khordadbeh, the geographer, lists trade routes and foreign lands, but offers no details on the Carolingians. We are told this is normal, that the Islamic world was uninterested in the Latin West, but that explanation grows weak when one examines how detailed their records are regarding Byzantium. Byzantine emperors are named, battles noted, embassies described. The East knew the East, it knew Rome, but somehow it did not see the shadow empire of Charlemagne. How does one explain an empire so vast, so influential, yet invisible to its contemporaries? In Chinese records, the silence is louder. The Tang dynasty, Peking, in the 8th century, maintained contact with Persia, India, Central Asia. Buddhist monks from China traveled to India. Traders brought silks west and silver east. Yet Western Europe, the alleged heart of the post-Roman world, goes unmentioned. Chinese court records list distant kingdoms, their tribute, their gifts, but not a single known Chinese chronicle references Charlemagne, the Carolingians, or even Rome in this period. Some may argue geography, that the Alps and deserts and steppes kept these worlds apart, but geography did not stop goods, or ideas, or the mention of names. If time was flowing smoothly through each civilization, why do their chronologies fail to converge? Let us look at eclipses again. In 760 CE, Chinese astronomers recorded a total solar eclipse on May 10th. Modern astronomical models confirm it. Islamic astronomers mention a similar event. But European sources, if we follow the standard chronology, mention nothing. The sky went black and no Christian monk noted it. Again in 810, Halley's comet appeared. It is well documented in Chinese and Islamic texts, but European records are inconsistent. Some refer to comets vaguely. Others ignore it altogether. Could it be that the comet appeared, but not in 810? Could it be that the event is real, but its position in the Western timeline is misaligned? When scholars overlay dated astronomical events across civilizations, the friction increases. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine VI was blinded and deposed in 797. That same year, the West says Charlemagne began preparations for his coronation. But in no source do the two events seem to connect. The coronation of 800, so dramatic, so political, elicits no known response from the Byzantine court. No letter, no condemnation, nothing. Either Constantinople was indifferent, or the event didn't occur in 800. Perhaps not at all. Calendars. 2. Refused to sync. The Julian calendar, used in the West, began drifting from solar reality. By the Gregorian reform of 1582, the drift was 10 days. But by strict calculation, it should have been closer to 13. A 3-day discrepancy roughly. 300 years of temporal inflation. Exactly the span of the phantom centuries. Chronologies within the West itself contradict. Irish annals place the death of kings years apart from continental records. The annals of Tigerneck and the annals of Ulster disagree on key dates. Scandinavian sagas, when aligned with Christian dates, often create impossible overlaps. Are these errors, or do they reflect an attempt to stretch real time over an artificial framework? The Carolingian Renaissance, supposedly a burst of intellectual and artistic energy, does not echo into the Islamic world. The Abbasid Caliphate, during its Golden Age, documented even minor states. Yet the West, if we trust the timeline, was undergoing a revival of classical learning, art, law, and science. But no Arab philosopher comments on it. No Persian geographer maps it. And no Chinese envoy seeks it. Is it possible that these revivals were not contemporary with the Abbasids, but constructed later to mirror their brilliance? To give the West a renaissance in the 9th century, just as the East basked in its own. Chronologies also diverge in trade. We find Abbasid diners in Scandinavia, true, but not in the Frankish heartland. We find silk routes linking China to the Levant, but not to Francia. The supposed economy of Charlemagne's empire leaves no ledger of imports, no record of ambassadors from Baghdad or Chang'an. A world power in isolation. That is not how power behaves. Empires leave trails. Not only in stone, but in time. They are observed, feared, envied, imitated. If the rest of the world did not see the Carolingian Empire, then perhaps it was not there to be seen. Could it be that the timeline of Europe was expanded artificially, its events backfilled, its chronology misaligned, not to deceive, but to match the grandeur of its neighbors? To create parity in the theater of history. To give Europe its own golden age, to match the Abbasids and the Tang. And if our timelines are illusions, that our comparisons are false, we do not live in the 21st century of a 2,000-year-old West. We live in a 1,700-year story, stretched to fit a calendar that needed meaning. So whose clock are we following? And if time itself has been multiplied, whose hand first turned the dial? History was once measured by the turning of the heavens, by solstices and equinoxes, by the rising of Sirius or the flooding of the Nile. The ancients aligned their temples to the stars, buried their dead with the sun, synchronized their rituals with celestial patterns. Time was sacred, observed, not imposed. But somewhere between the stars and the scriptorium, time broke. It collapsed. What we now call chronology is a latticework cobbled from rains, reignited myths, dogmas, calendars, and carbon decay. It pretends to flow smoothly from Rome to Renaissance, from Christ to Charlemagne. But under scrutiny, the flow reveals seams, graphs, stitchings, evidence of a deeper dislocation. If the previous parts of this investigation have exposed cracks here, we stare into the abyss behind them. Let us begin with the very idea of the Middle Ages. Why is it called middle? What precisely does it sit between antiquity and modernity, we are told? A convenient label for 1,000 years of slow progress, but the term is telling. A middle is not a destination, it is a placeholder. A fog, a bridge between clarity and clarity. And bridges are often where forgeries hide. Our timeline rests on fragile constructs, king lists, papal successions, chronicles, relics, ruins. And yet, when held against the cold metrics of astronomy, or the traceable movement of genes, or the layers of earth, the alignment collapses. Charlemagne's empire appears too quickly, flourishes too neatly, vanishes too cleanly. The saints multiply with no martyrs. The churches stand with no faithful. The books bloom with no teachers. 1,000 years of continuity, but no weight. Could it be that the Middle Ages were not the middle of anything, but an invention altogether? We must revisit the idea of phantom time, not just as a historical theory, but as a psychological reality. What does it mean for a society to believe it inhabits a time that never was? It means anchoring your identity to an illusion, celebrating jubilees and anniversaries that point to false origins, mourning events that never occurred, praying to saints that were never canonized, passing laws in the name of kings that never Rain. It means living within a calendar that is not only flawed, but fabricated. The Gregorian reform was supposed to correct a drift. But what if the drift was not in the sky, but in the record? 10 days were erased, but how many years were added? The reformers accepted without question the underlying chronology. They fixed the calendar, but left the timeline untouched. Their correction may have only obscured the deeper falsehood. Time, once observed through the cosmos, became administered by the Church, and when the Church became the arbiter of time, history became dogma. To question the saints' date was to question their sanctity. To challenge a king's reign was to challenge divine order. To ask why a coin bore an emperor's name with no empire was to risk heresy. And so the lie solidified through repetition, through liturgy, through architecture, through education. Children were taught the sequence of popes and emperors as scripture. Pilgrims walked roads whose builders were never named. Masses were said on feast days calculated by algorithms built on fabricated dates. And slowly, the illusion passed from scribe to monk, from monk to prince, from prince to professor, until it became truth. Today we measure time with atomic precision. But our historical clock, our sense of when, is still set by medieval hands. The past is not only a place, it is a construction. And this construction has walls. It keeps out the inconvenient, the contradictory, the impossible. Archaeologists who unearth Roman artifacts in layers dated to the 8th century are told to revise their assumptions. Radiocarbon dates that return anomalously early results are dismissed as contamination. Manuscripts that bear later script styles are declared copies, not anomalies. The system protects itself because the cost of collapse is too great. If we admit that centuries were fabricated, then the implications cascade. Modern legal systems, tied to ancient precedent, lose their roots. Religious traditions must confront the possibility that their sacred lineage is shorter than claimed. Nations founded on millennial heritage become hollow, and perhaps most frightening, we must admit we no longer know what time it is. There is also a psychological terror. Humans crave origin, lineage, descent. To lose the thread to find that our ancestors were phantoms, that our great kings never lived, is to lose ourselves. It is a vertigo of identity. But perhaps, in that vertigo, we find clarity. If the timeline was manipulated, it was manipulated by someone. Not by accident, not in ignorance, but in pursuit of power. To invent a century is to invent authority. 2. Insert a ruler is to claim obedience. To forge a council is to forge consensus. To rewrite time is to rule it. So who ruled? The Holy Roman Empire, the papacy, the scriptoria of Fulda and Tours, the imperial court of Otto III, the scholars around Gerbert of Aurillac, the Byzantine redactors, the councils that made silence seem sacred. They were not conspiring in secret. They were crafting reality in the open, believing they were guardians of continuity. They had a vision of order, and to preserve it, they shaped the past. We live within that shape. Our textbooks, our museums, our holidays, the year on our coins, the age of our cathedrals, the number of our millennia. And yet, if we trace time backward, we do not find a clear road. We find a fog, a space too quiet, too clean, too compliant. An empire that rises in silence, a church that governs the dead, a king crowned by no witnesses, a script that appears without error, a relic from a war that never happened, a saint with no birth, a calendar with no clock, a present built atop a past that was scripted. So what now? If time itself was forged, where do we stand? And if we stand on a lie, what lies ahead? It was never just about history. It was about control, the manipulation of dates, of dynasties, of divine events. These were not scholarly mistakes, nor innocent confusions passed down through centuries of poor transmission. They were instruments, Instruments used by those who understood something deeper than the rest. To shape the past is to dominate the present. And in dominating the present, you take hold of the future. That is what the lie of time became: total dominion over perception, memory, and belief. We now stand at the edge of this realization. 20 parts into a descent through quiet centuries, where kings leave no graves and stars deny their alignment, where the coins echo but the economy is silent, where churches rise with no labor force, and scripts emerge without error or predecessor, where emperors are crowned in darkness, and laws cite rulers who have no bones. All of it points not to accidental gaps, but to deliberate insertion. If phantom time is real, if the years 614 to 911 never happened, then we must ask a final, devastating question. How does a fiction become reality? The answer lies in ritual, in repetition, in architecture and calendar, in every Sunday Mass, every coronation oath, every stone laid in the name of a saint who never lived. Time, once a river we drifted upon, became a page we were made to read again and again, until we forgot we had ever known another story. We do not celebrate the year 2025 because it is 2025 years since anything verifiable. We celebrate it because someone long ago said it was. And we inherited that declaration. Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord. But which Lord? Which year? We are told that time began again with Christ, that Rome fell, that darkness descended, that after centuries of decay, a spark returned. Charlemagne restored the empire. The church preserved knowledge. The Renaissance awaited, yet that spark flickers under scrutiny. Too small, too still. Why did no one in the East notice Charlemagne's coronation? Why do saints born in the 8th century only appear in text from the 11th? Why does the Gregorian calendar skip only 10 days when 13 were needed? Why do Chinese, Arab, and Byzantine records refuse to acknowledge the events that anchor Western time? Because the Western clock was rewound, reset, adjusted by rulers and popes who saw opportunity in blank space. Otto III, crowned in Rome with visions of a reborn empire. Gerbert of Aurlach, Pope Sylvester II, a man of science and secrets, whispering algorithms to the heavens. Together, they did not merely reform Europe. They reset its clock. They placed themselves at the fulcrum of time. And they succeeded, because the illusion was not only written, it was lived. Monks copied text for centuries, embedding the false time deeper into the record. Priests celebrated liturgies uncalculated. Feast days, sanctifying the lie with incense. Scholars aligned Easter tables, astronomical tables, and royal genealogies with years that never unfolded. Architects dated their cathedrals to the Phantom Age, setting stone into the very fiction. Once the lie became practice, the practice became belief. And once belief took hold, truth was not needed. Children were taught the dates. Pilgrims journeyed to shrines founded in myths. Kings drew legitimacy from imaginary predecessors. Nations claimed millennial continuity, and thus, time, the most objective of measures, became subjective, became institutional. Became ... sacred. The danger now is not the falsity of time, but the power it still holds. For if we question the centuries between Rome and Renaissance, what else falls? The church's claim to apostolic succession, the university's claim to tradition, the state's claim to longevity, the idea that we are modern, evolved, standing on the shoulders of millennia. What if those shoulders were phantoms? What if our foundations are built upon sand? Already, we can feel the walls trembling. Scholars find mismatches in carbon dating. Historians acknowledge that medieval records are inconsistent at best, fabricated at worst. The archaeological void grows more visible. The East and West continue to disagree not only about theology, but about time itself. And somewhere, deep in our cultural memory, a question remains, a suspicion, a whisper, that something is missing. Or rather, something was added. Too clean, too smooth, too silent. If phantom time exists, then everything after it, everything that rests upon it, is compromised. Our reckoning with the past is incomplete because the past has been rewritten. And if history can be rewritten, then so can the future. So where do we go from here? We live in a time declared, not discovered. In a year counted from an uncertain zero. In a civilization whose roots may be not in centuries, but in scripts. In scripts forged for power. In calendars bent to ambition. In empires that edited time itself. We cannot unlive the lie, but we can see it. We can recognize the scaffolding beneath the cathedral, the fiction beneath the feast day, the silence between the lines of the annals. We can listen for what was not said. We can relearn how to reckon with time, not as inheritance, but as construct. And in doing so, we may ask not with accusation, but with awakening. If time was written by kings and popes to suit their purpose, then what is our time? And if this year is a fiction, what year is it really?